Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. And today I am going to be taking a look at the massive and incredible classical catalogue from perhaps the greatest pianist of all time. He's in my Mount Rushmore with Pat Metheny, Chick Corea and Miles Davis, and he's a gentleman who, quite frankly, in my opinion, needs no introduction whatsoever. I am talking about, of course, the one and only legendary pianist, composer, and bandleader Keith Jarrett. And this is a follow up edition to the last one that I did, where I discussed all of Keith Jarrett's catalogue of solo piano albums. And for today's special edition, I am going to be discussing Keith Jarrett's catalogue of classical albums. And I can honestly tell you now, there is no bad album in Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue. Obviously, there are some that are a little bit better than others. There are some that are excellent. There are some that are legendary. There are some that are completely unknown. And there are one or two that are very underrated. And we all know that Keith Jarrett is an incredible jazz pianist and improviser. But there is a whole different side to Keith Jarrett's musical persona. Keith Jarrett is an incredible classical composer, and all of these albums are very different. They all have their own unique personality, and they don't all sound the same. There are some solo piano albums, there are some solo harpsichord albums, there are some solo organ albums, there are some albums where he's not playing on them at all, where he's written and composed for a featured soloist backed by a full orchestra. And there are some orchestral albums as well. So there's a little bit of everything in Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue. And as I've said before, Keith Jarrett has had two careers, one in jazz and one in classical. And Keith Jarrett is one of the few musicians who have been able to successfully cross over from jazz to classical. And there have only been a small handful of musicians who have been able to make such a successful transition. Guys like Pat Metheny, Wynton Marsalis, Miles Davis, Hiromi, Brad Meldo, and Chick Corea, to name a few, who have all been able to successfully transition from jazz to classical. And with Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue, there's lots of influences of Bartok, Bach, and Mozart, to name a few. But Keith Jarrett, when the history books are written, he will go down as one of the most important composers of all time. And he really shows his versatility in his classical catalogue. So, as I mentioned before, he doesn't just play piano, he's also playing harpsichord, organ, and many other instruments as well. But all of these albums showcase his composing skills as a classical composer. So, for today's special edition, I am going to be taking a look at Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue of albums, which is a total of 19 albums. And as always, I am going to be talking about each album individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one. Not an easy challenge, especially when you've got so much music and so many great albums to choose from. And as I said before, there's no bad album in Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue. Any of these albums could easily be a number one or an all-time favourite. So we're going to start with the first classical album, and this one came out in 1974, and it's a double album, and this is the one that kickstarted Keith Jarrett's classical career, and this one is called In the Light. So In the Light, as I mentioned, is a double album, and this marks the first time ever that Keith Jarrett had recorded and released an album featuring classical material. And as you'd expect, it's a fantastic album, some beautiful, haunting music, all written and composed by Keith Jarrett. And it's very different because There are some tracks that Keith Jarrett isn't playing on this album, but it's a great showcase for Keith Jarrett's composing skills, and this would be the start of many great classical albums to come. And what more can I say, really? In the Lights is an excellent album and definitely a great place to start if you're looking to get into Keith Jarrett's classical works. So let's have a look, shall we? So there is a full breakdown of all of the pieces and some liner notes from Keith Jarrett. And there is the man himself. And there is the track listing and who plays on what. So as I said already, all of the compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So on disc 1, we've got Metamorphosis, which is 19 minutes long and it's performed by the Sudfunk Symphony Orchestra and it's conducted by Melaiden Gutschir, and it's got Willie Frivgel on flute, who is the featured soloist, and it's a lovely piece of music and a great way to start this album. And then we've got the Fugharta for harpsichord, which features Keith Jarrett on piano, and it's 5 minutes long, absolutely beautiful. And then we've got Brass Quintet for the American Brass Quintet, which is like 20 minutes long, absolutely lovely, very brassy, as it says in the title, but great music. And then on disc 2, we got a Pageant Hymn, which is a piano piece by Keith Jarrett, which is 7 minutes long. And then we've got String Quartet, performed by the Fritz Solnitner Quartet, which is 16 minutes long. And then we've got Short Piece for Guitar and Strings, with a guest appearance from Oregon guitarist Ralph Towner and performed by the Sudfunk Symphony Orchestra and it's conducted by Keith Jarrett. Brilliant playing from Ralph Towner. And it's interesting because if you look through Keith Jarrett's career, he has very rarely ever collaborated with guitarists on his albums. So to have Ralph Towner on his album is quite special because, as I said, Keith Jarrett very rarely ever played with guitar players throughout his career, and it's a nice treat. And Ralph Towner, one of the greatest guitar players of all time, he is right at home with a full orchestra, and he just sounds incredible. And if you want to hear Ralph Towner in that sort of environment, highly recommend you check out some of Vince Mendoza's albums. Ralph Towner appears on a couple of them, and he sounds fantastic on them too. So it's cool to hear him in this setting, and Ralph Towner, absolutely amazing as always. And then we've got Crystal Moments, which is a piece for 4 cello and 2 trombones, and that's like 4 minutes long. Lovely piece of music as well. And then we've got the 12-minute epic In the Cave, in the Light, which is featured Keith Jarrett on piano, gong, and percussion, and he also conducts the proceedings. And that's also performed by the Sudfunk Symphony Orchestra. But absolutely great stuff, all good music. And as I said, the perfect showcase for Keith Jarrett's classical composing skills. And the standout tracks for me on disc 1 are Metamorphosis and Brass Quintet. And the standout tracks for me on disc 2 are a Pagan Hymn, Short Piece for Guitar and Strings, and In the Cave, in the Light. But all of it, as you'd expect, is tremendous stuff. So there you have it, Keith Jarrett's In the Light, the one that started all of Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue, and a lovely album and great listening if you're into classical music. So there you have it, In the Light, excellent stuff, and the one that started all of this off. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1975, and this one is called Luminescence. So Luminescence, while it is a Keith Jarrett album in name. Keith Jarrett doesn't actually play or appear on this one, but however, he did compose all of the material, and the featured soloist for Luminescence is Keith Jarrett's bandmate from his European quartet, saxophonist Jan Garbarek, and he's backed by the Sudfunk Symphony Orchestra, who is conducted by Miladen Gutschia, and there are only three pieces on Luminescence, and it's an amazing album. Jan Garbarek has never sounded better than he does in this environment. He delivers bone chilling, haunting, and very aggressive sax playing. And if you ever wanted to write a classical composition to feature saxophone and orchestra, I can't think of anyone more suitable or better than Jan Garbarek. He's one of the greatest and most unique sax players on the planet, and he's just amazing. He really sounds incredible on this album. And we've got only three pieces. We've got New Minor, which is 13 minutes long, Windsong, which is the shortest piece, which is 6 minutes, and we've got the title track, Luminescence, which is 15 minutes long, and it's absolutely amazing. Keith Jarrett doesn't actually play on this one, as I said already, but his presence is very much felt and really showcased with his classical composing skills. And Keith Jarrett just wrote a bunch of great music, and the musicians who play on this album really deliver and do an excellent job and deliver a fine performance. And the standout tracks for me are New Minor and the title track Luminescence. Beautiful music. Jan Garbarek with a full orchestra. He is on top form. Love this album. Haven't listened to this one in quite a while, but the times that I did listen to it in the past, it's just absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. It really is. So there you have it. Luminescence, an excellent addition to the Keith Jarrett classical catalogue, and highly recommended for all fans of Keith Jarrett and Jan Garbarek. Doesn't get any better than this. So there you have it. Luminescence. Absolutely beautiful stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1976, and it's a double album, and it's a solo organ album, and this one is called Hymns Spheres. So, as we all know, Keith Jarrett, of course, is a legendary solo pianist, but this album, Hymns Spheres, we get to hear a different side to Keith Jarrett's playing. We get to see him performing church organ music, and church organ has always been a huge part of classical music for centuries, and it's very rare you ever get to see a jazz pianist crossing over and performing on a church organ. But Keith Jarrett, never one to repeat himself, always reinventing himself, really comes out of his box here and delivers an absolute masterpiece and really shows his versatility. And it's a lovely album. And, you know, sometimes church organs can be an acquired taste. Some people like it, some people don't like it. But I think what you have here with someone like Keith Jarrett, he makes it his own and plays it as if he were playing the grand piano. But it's different, but it's very enjoyable. And if you're into this sort of thing, then I think Hymns Spheres is definitely the one for you to check out. It's got some great playing, some very moving and haunting music, and it's great. I think it's a really good album. And I think some people may have probably overlooked this one. You know, organs, as I said, can be an acquired taste. You know, some people would prefer to hear an organ in a band, not necessarily solo, but it's really good. I think everyone should definitely check this one out. So we'll just have a quick look. And there he is. So, Spheres, the title track, is made up of 9 movements, and we've got 2 tracks: Hymn of Remembrance, which is the opener, and Hymn of Release, which is the closer. So Sphere's first movement is 7 minutes long. Sphere's second movement is 13 minutes long. Sphere's third movement is 10 minutes long. Sphere's movement 4 is 12 minutes long. Sphere's fifth movement is 4 minutes long. Sphere's sixth movement is 11 minutes long. The seventh movement, 8 minutes long. The eighth movement, 5 minutes long. And the last movement, which is 9 minutes long, is 12 minutes. And then the two tracks, Hymn of Remembrance and Hymn of Release, they're like 4 minutes each. But all music written and composed by Keith Jarrett, and it's absolutely beautiful. All of the music is completely improvised, and it just sounds fantastic. And the standout tracks for me are Hymn of Remembrance, second movements, third movements, and fourth movements, sixth movements, and the ninth movements, and Hymn of Release. But tremendous album. Keith Jarrett performing in solo organ. Lovely music, highly recommended. Everyone check this one out. It's really good. Little bit on the underrated side, perhaps, but still tremendous music nonetheless. And I think every Keith Jarrett fan should have this one in their collection. So there you have it. Hymn, Spheres, excellent album, and one of my favourites from Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue. Tremendous album. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1976. And this album is legendary, and it's held in very high esteem and very highly regarded by all musicians and fans alike. And it's one of my all-time favorites as well. And it's a fantastic album. It's one of Keith Jarrett's absolute best ever in his classical catalogue. And this one is called Aborzina. So Aborzina is a full orchestral album featuring Keith Jarrett on piano, Jan Garbarek on tenor and soprano saxophones from the European Quartet, and Charlie Haydn on double bass from Keith Jarrett's American Quartet. So a true crossover album, featuring Keith Jarrett's important collaborators from two of his most important bands. And we've got the string orchestra, who are members of the Radio Symphony Orchestra, and they are conducted by Miladen Gutschir. And it's a fantastic album. It's one of the greatest orchestral albums ever made, and it's hauntingly beautiful. There are only 3 pieces on this album, but my goodness, the playing, everything, the arrangements, the compositions, it's all top notch. Everyone on this album is on excellent form, and it's a classic. It really is. So there we are. There's the compositions. So we've got 3 pieces. Runes, which is 15 minutes long. Solaria March, which is 9 minutes long, which is like the shortest track of the 3. And we've got Mirrors, which is the longest track of the entire album. It's like 27 minutes long. And trust me when I tell you, it doesn't get any better than this. Aborzina is absolutely amazing. Fantastic album from start to finish. And what more can you say, really? It's a classic, as I said already. And the standout tracks for me is Runes and Mirrors. But the whole album, from top to bottom, is just beautiful. Great piano playing from Keith Jarrett. Excellent sax work from Jan Garbarek, who performs double duty on both tenor and soprano saxophones. And Charlie Haydn on double bass. He just sounds great in everything he does. He just really brings so much richness in his playing, and he really bulks up the sound. And the orchestra, the Radio Symphony Orchestra, they're on fine form as well. Excellent album, absolutely beautiful. This is definitely the one for all Keith Jarrett fans to have in their collection. It's so good. And I've kind of always looked at Aborzina as kind of like a continuation of Luminescence, but just taken to the next level. It's very much in that sort of style and realm, but highly enjoyable and a great listening experience, in my opinion. So there you have it. Abozina, one of the greatest albums ever made for the ECM label. Doesn't get any better than that. Love this album. Great stuff. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1980, and this one is called The Celestial Hawk for orchestra, percussion, and piano. So the Celestial Hawk features Keith Jarrett on piano and the Syracuse Symphony Orchestra, which is conducted by Christopher Keane. And as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, this is a magnificent album. Beautiful piano playing by Keith Jarrett, excellent orchestrations and great arrangements, and unbelievable playing from the Syracuse Symphony Orchestra. And all of the compositions are written and composed by Keith Jarrett. And the Celestial Hawk, which is the title track, is made up of three movements. So the first movement is 18 minutes long. The second movement is 7 minutes long, which is the shortest piece of the three. And the third movement is 14 minutes long. And from top to bottom, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett, is absolutely fantastic. And the standout tracks for me are the first movement and the third movement, but all three movements are just absolutely incredible. And this is right up there with some of the other great classical albums that Keith Jarrett has put out. And I like it. It's a really good album, very enjoyable, a great listening experience, as are all of these classical albums from Keith Jarrett. And it's very good. Not an easy one to find, but highly recommended that you check this one out. It's very good. So there you have it, The Celestial Hawk for orchestra, percussion, and piano. Fantastic, and another great addition to the ever growing classical catalogue of Keith Jarrett. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1982, and this one is called Ritual. So Ritual doesn't actually feature Keith Jarrett, but he did compose all of the music for this album, and it's a solo piano album performed by another musician, and that is, of course, Dennis Russell Davis, who has collaborated very closely with Keith Jarrett for a lot of years on a lot of his orchestral works. And Russell Davis, to his credit, does an outstanding job, not only playing all of Keith Jarrett's compositions, but really channeling the spirit of his piano playing, but also staying true to his own. And it's a fantastic album, not an easy one to find, but highly enjoyable and a great listening experience. And Keith Jarrett himself said that there are very few musicians in the world who can replicate his playing. And Russell Davis was definitely the exception to that rule. And as I said, when you're listening to this album, sometimes you almost forget that it's not Keith Jarrett because Russell Davis does such a great job that sometimes you're mistaken that you think it is Keith Jarrett because he sounds exactly like him. And I really like this one, and it doesn't really get talked about enough. And I didn't buy this one for a really long time because I thought this was one of those cover albums where musicians would play the music of somebody else, but they would just put their own spin on things. But I never realized that when I did my research on this one, that this album actually is a Keith Jarrett album. And I'm really glad I got this one because it's really good and very underrated as well. So let's have a quick look. So there is a little bit about how this project came together. And there are two pieces that are written and composed by Keith Jarrett. So we've got Ritual Part 1, which is 18 minutes long, and Ritual Part 2, which is 13 minutes long. But very enjoyable. I enjoyed both tracks. As I said, there's only two tracks, but they're very long. So you can't really say one is better than the other. They're both standouts and they both work together as one. So you can't really say one's better than the other. It's just like one big piece of music, but made up into two parts. But it's a very good album. Russell Davies does a fantastic job, and it's a solo piano album, so you know what you're going to expect, and it's really good and it's highly recommended. So there you have it, Ritual. Excellent album, very underrated, but very enjoyable nonetheless. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1987, and it's a double album, and this one is called Book of Ways. So Book of Ways features Keith Jarrett on the clavichord, and the title track is made up of several parts spread out on two discs. And disc one is made up of 10 pieces, which is a total of 47 minutes of music. And disc two is made up of 9 pieces, which is made up of 53 minutes. So, in a way, you're kind of getting like parts one and two instead of two separate albums. You're getting it as a double album. And Keith Jarrett, once again, showing his versatility playing the clavichord, whereas previously he played either solo piano or organ. So you get to hear Keith Jarrett performing on a different instrument, but still very much in the keyboard realm, so to speak. And it's a lovely album. The acoustics, the production, everything about it is just beautiful. And this was not an easy album to find. This was one of the last Keith Jarrett albums I didn't actually have, and it took me a long time to find this one, but I managed to get this one in the end, and only to find out later that this album was getting reissued. So didn't really matter to me because I got my copy of the original, but it's nice that there's a reissue out there for people to buy for those who couldn't find it previously. So it's a really good album. As I said, originally not an easy one to track down, but if you do manage to get a copy of this, it's really good. And if you're into this sort of music or this style of playing, then this is definitely one worth checking out. It's a fantastic album and highly recommended. So there you have it. Book of Ways, excellent album and highly recommended for all Keith Jarrett fans. Absolutely brilliant. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1988, and it's a double album, and it's a solo piano album, and it's Keith Jarrett playing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and this one is called Das Hulete Clavier. So, as I mentioned, this is Keith Jarrett playing solo piano, playing the compositions of Johann Sebastian Bach, and it's, as you'd expect, absolutely gorgeous. Keith Jarrett plays his interpretations of Bach's material and puts his own spin on the music. And as you'd expect, it's Keith Jarrett at his very best playing solo piano. And all of the pieces that are on both discs are relatively short pieces, clocking in at 1 minute to 2 minutes and so forth. But it's a really good album, very enjoyable, beautiful playing from Keith Jarrett, and you can really hear Keith Jarrett playing from the heart, and he delivers an outstanding performance, as you'd expect from perhaps the greatest piano player of all time. And he really delivers. And, you know, as great as Keith Jarrett is playing all of these classical pieces, he's equally as good playing his own material. And this is just another classic showcase for Keith Jarrett's versatility. He can do it all, whether it's playing his own material or playing classical compositions. You always get the absolute best from Keith Jarrett, and it's a lovely album, in my opinion. And it's one that I tend to reach for quite often if I want to just relax and just mellow out and just chill for the evening. This is one of those albums that I turn on each and every time, and it's a fantastic album, in my opinion. And it's available on the ECM News Series, which is ECM's classical label, which features lots of great classical works. And Keith Jarrett, as I mentioned earlier, has had two careers, one in jazz and one in classical. So you're essentially getting two separate catalogues for the price of one artist. And there's lots of great music to check out on the ECM News Series, and this is definitely one of them. So there you have it. Das Wollte Prete Clavier. Brilliant album and highly recommended for all classical fans of Johann Sebastian Bach. So there you have it. Das Wollte Prete Clavier. Excellent stuff and one of my all-time favourites. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1989, and it's Keith Jarrett once again performing the compositions of Johann Sebastian Bach, and this one is called Goldberg Variations. So Goldberg Variations features Keith Jarrett on the harpsichord, and he's performing, as I mentioned, all of the compositions of Johann Sebastian Bach. And there are 32 tracks on this album, and they're all relatively short pieces, clocking in at a minute or 2 minutes. And this is Keith Jarrett once again at his very best, performing solo and delivering a performance for the ages. And it's a lovely album. Get to hear Keith Jarrett once again showcased with his versatility, and he just delivers pure magic on this album. And it's a beautiful album, highly recommended for all classical fans. And from top to bottom, it's just a very deep and moving album. And as I said, Keith Jarrett can do it all, whether he's playing his own compositions or playing classical compositions from a famous classical composer. It's all good, it's all music, and it's all Keith Jarrett doing what he does best, and that's play from the heart and put his soul into everything that he does. And for me, it's one of Keith Jarrett's finest hours, and it doesn't get any better than this. So there you have it. Goldberg Variations, very enjoyable and a beautiful album, courtesy of the all time great himself, Keith Jarrett. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1981, and it's a double album, and it features Keith Jarrett on the harpsichord once again, and it sees Keith Jarrett playing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and it's a follow-up to the previous album that came out in 1988, and this one is called Das Wundertätige Klavier Buch 2. So this is a follow-up to the first one that came out in 1988, whereas the first one was solo piano. This one is solo harpsichord, and it's a very enjoyable album. There are 12 tracks on both discs, so that's a total of 24 pieces. And unlike the first one, where the pieces were relatively short ones, this one sees Keith Jarrett extend those pieces to around about 2 to 3 minutes, 5 minutes to 7 minutes. And Keith Jarrett, once again, does what he does best, and that's play his heart on his sleeve, puts his soul into the music, and just plays from the heart. And it's just an absolute magnificent album. And some of the harpsichord albums are very enjoyable because, as I mentioned before, you get to hear a different side to Keith Jarrett's playing. You know, we're so used to hearing Keith Jarrett's playing solo piano that he can also play other instruments as well, and he plays them all to perfection. And Keith Jarrett is such a perfectionist. He always plays with every precise note. It's all there for a reason, and an amazing improviser. And what a performance from one of the all-time greats. And it doesn't get any better than this. It's a brilliant album, highly recommended for all classical fans, and this is definitely one to have. So there you have it. Das Wundertätige Klavier Buch 2. Magnificent album and a great follow-up to the first one. Absolutely love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1982, and it's a double solo piano album, and this one is called 24 Preludes and Fugues, Op. 87. So this is Keith Jarrett playing solo piano, playing the music of Dmitri Shostakovich, and as you'd expect, solo piano, Keith Jarrett doesn't get any better than that. And Keith Jarrett, as always, playing from the heart and delivering excellent playing. And this is a lovely album. Keith Jarrett at his best once again, playing solo piano, and it's just fantastic. So we're just going to have a quick little look. So as you can see, all of the compositions are here, and there's 24 pieces altogether spread out on 2 discs. So we've got 12 tracks on disc 1, and we've got 12 tracks on disc 2, and there's a little bit of information about how this project came together. There's some more liner notes here as well, and a little breakdown of each piece. And same as before, a little breakdown of each piece. And the same for here as well. And the same for here as well. And the rest of it is all in German. And yeah, it's all good. It's great stuff here. If you like solo piano, if you like Keith Jarrett, this is definitely one to check out. It's absolutely amazing and highly recommended. Little bit of a rarity, but not an easy one to find. But if you can find it, definitely worth listening to. It's very good. And as I said, if you're a fan of Keith Jarrett and you like Keith Jarrett playing solo piano, this is definitely one for you. So there you have it, 24 Preludes and Fugues, Op. 87, the music of Dmitri Shostakovich. Excellent stuff. Love it. One of my all-time favorites. Great album. Highly recommend you check it out. It's really good. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1993, and it's a double album, and it features Keith Jarrett once again on the harpsichord, playing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and this one is called The French Suites. So the French Suites is a double album made up of 6 suites that are spread out on 2 discs, and Keith Jarrett, as always, plays from the heart and delivers a magnificent performance on the harpsichord. And it's just lovely music, very atmospheric, very haunting, and just all round fantastic. And the musicianship that's on full display here is second to none. And you really get to see Keith Jarrett's other side of his musical persona really come to the front, and it is showcased to the fullest. And Keith Jarrett is just on top form as always. So let's have a quick look, shall we? So on disc 1, it's made up of 3 suites. So it's 19 tracks spread out on 3 suites. And then on disc 2, we've got 22 tracks spread out on 3 suites as well. So as you can see there are all the French suites. And most of the tracks are quite relatively short pieces. Some are like 2 to 3 minutes, some are a minute, and you know, they're all quite relatively short pieces, but very enjoyable. And the same for disc 2 as well, all relatively short pieces. Some are 2 minutes, some are 3 minutes, some are 4 minutes, and some are just like under a minute. So as I said, they're all short pieces, but they all make up one complete suite. And just a little bit of the production notes as well. And it's a magnificent album. So Suite 1 is 16 minutes long in total. Suite 2 is 14 minutes in total. And Suite 3 is 16 minutes in total. And then on disc 2, Suite 4 is made up of 14 minutes long in total, and Suite 5 is made up of 90 minutes in total, and Suite 6 is made up of 16 minutes in total. So, as I said, they're all quite relatively short pieces, but if you ignore the fact that all of the pieces are relatively short and you just appreciate it and listen to it as complete suites, they are actually quite long pieces of music in total, but very enjoyable nonetheless. And Keith Jarrett at his best, as always, playing solo. So there you have it. The French Suites, excellent album, and another great harpsichord album, courtesy of the one and only Keith Jarrett. So there you have it, the French Suites. Excellent stuff and very enjoyable. Love this one. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1984, and this could very well be my all-time favourite classical album from Keith Jarrett. And this, for me, is where Keith Jarrett really peaked as a classical composer, and I think this album is just absolutely fantastic. And this one is called Bridge of Light. So, Bridge of Light features Keith Jarrett on piano, and featured soloists are Michelle Makarski on violin, Marcia Butler on oboe, and Patricia McCarthy on viola. And we've got the Fairfield Orchestra, which is conducted by Thomas Crawford. And there are 4 pieces of music made up of 8 tracks, and it's just fantastic. And Keith Jarrett isn't featured on all of these pieces, but he's composed all of the music. And we've got Elegy for violin and string orchestra, Adagio for oboe and string orchestra, Sonata for violin and piano, and the title track, Bridge of Lights for viola and orchestra. Fantastic album. Keith Jarrett really hits his stride and really is at his peak as a classical composer, and it's just absolutely unbelievable music. So we'll just have a little quick look. So there's some liner notes from Keith Jarrett about this project and how it all came together. And there he is, the man himself. And there's the track listing as well. So the first track, Elegy for violin and string orchestra, is 14 minutes long, and Adagio for oboe and string orchestra is 9 minutes long. And then we've got Sonata for violin and piano, which is the longest track of the entire album, which is made up of 5 pieces. So we've got Celebration, Song, Dance, Birth, and Dance, more like a reprise. And then we've got the title track, Bridge of Light for viola and orchestra, which is like 17 minutes long. And all of these compositions are just absolutely beautiful. And for me, this is probably Keith Jarrett's best orchestral album ever. It's just really good. And the standout tracks for me are Elegy for violin and string orchestra, and Sonata for violin and piano, and the title track, Bridge of Light. It's just absolutely wonderful music, and Keith Jarrett really hit his peak with this one. Fantastic album, absolutely love it. So there you have it, Bridge of Light, probably Keith Jarrett's best orchestral album ever, and magnificent stuff, and highly recommended to all Keith Jarrett fans if you want to get into his orchestral work. This is just brilliant stuff, absolutely marvelous. So there you have it, Bridge of Light, excellent album, one of my all-time favorites, if not my favorite Keith Jarrett classical album of all time. Love this one. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1985, and it's another favorite of mine, and this one is called Handel Suites for Keyboard. So this is a solo piano album, and it features Keith Jarrett playing the music of George Frederick Handel, and it's got 7 suites, and it's a fantastic album and a very lovely album, very atmospheric and very enjoyable and very pleasing to the ear. and Keith Jarrett, of course, at his absolute best, playing solo piano. So let's have a quick look. So as I mentioned already, the album is made up of 7 suites, and there's some liner notes about how this project came together. And there are 29 tracks in total, and they're all relatively short pieces, all clocking in at 2 minutes to 3 minutes to under a minute, and it's absolutely brilliant stuff. And as I said, there's 7 suites in total, and we've got at least 4 tracks each on all of the suites. And all of the suites, you have to really listen to it in total as one complete thing, but it's very enjoyable as well. And some liner notes from Keith Jarrett, and the liner notes same as before, but they're all in another language as well. But it's great stuff, as you can see. All good. It's all music. It's all Keith Jarrett at his absolute best, and for me, it's just a really good album. And the thing about Keith Jarrett in this sort of environment, he can take these pieces and just go anywhere he wants, and the payoff is just fantastic. And the playing, the arrangements, the production, everything about this album is just top notch. And when you have a guy like Keith Jarrett, whether he's playing his own compositions or whether he's playing compositions from a classical composer, Keith Jarrett always gives it his all, and he always delivers each and every time, and he never disappoints. And this is a magnificent album, and definitely one worth checking out. So there you have it. Handel Suites for Keyboard. Magnificent album, and another favourite of mine from Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue. Tremendous stuff. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1996, and it's a double album, and this one is called W.A. Mozart Piano Concertos, Masonic Funeral Music, Symphony in G minor, and this features Keith Jarrett on the piano with a full orchestra conducted by Dennis Russell Davis, and it's absolutely amazing, equally as good as Bridge of Light or In the Light. It's just a magnificent album, and we've got 2 discs with lots of classical material. We've got on disc 1 Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, number 23 in a major K 488, and Concerto for Piano and Orchestra number 27 in B flat major K 595. And then on disc 2 we got Masonic Funeral Music K 477 and Concerto for Piano and Orchestra number 21 in C major K 467 and Symphony number 40 in G minor K 550. Excellent stuff. If you enjoy orchestral music, and if you put Keith Jarrett in the mix, you know you're going to get an absolute classic album. And this is very enjoyable. Russell Davis, of course, has been a main collaborator for Keith Jarrett for lots of years, and he does a really good job conducting the proceedings. And Keith Jarrett on piano just is on top form as always, delivering amazing solos after amazing solos, and just puts on a performance of a lifetime, just like he does on all of these albums. And it's a great album, quite a rare one to find, but if you like orchestral music, this is definitely one worth checking out. It's very enjoyable listening to Keith Jarrett playing the music of Mozart, who, as we all know, is one of the greatest classical composers of all time. And when you put Keith Jarrett there, you're getting the absolute best. So there you have it. W.A. Mozart, Piano Concertos, Masonic Funeral Music, and Symphony in G minor. Excellent stuff and very enjoyable. Highly recommended. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 1999, and it's a double album, and it's a follow-up to the one that's came out before, and this one is called Mozart's Piano Concertos K271, 453, 466, Adagio and Fugue K546. And it features Keith Jarrett on piano, and it features Stuttgarter Cam Orchestra and Dennis Russell Davis conducting the orchestration. Excellent album, as you'd expect. Fantastic playing from Keith Jarrett. Dennis Russell Davis does an excellent job conducting the orchestra, and it's just lovely music from top to bottom. And on disc one, we've got Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, number 20 in D minor, K466, and Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, number 17 in G major, K453. And then on disc two, we've got Concerto for Piano and Orchestra, number 9 in E flat major, K271. And we've got Adagio and Fugue in C minor, K546. Tremendous album, all long pieces, very enjoyable. If you're into classical music or orchestrated material, this is definitely one for you. This is such an amazing album. Lengthy pieces, unbelievable playing. Keith Jarrett on top form as always. Just a magnificent album and very enjoyable and a great listening experience as well. So, highly recommend you check this one out. It's really good. So, there you have it. Mozart's Piano Concertos K271, 453, 466, Adagio and Fugue K546. Excellent album and a great follow up to the previous one. Absolutely tremendous. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 2015, and it's a live album that features two different live performances, one from 1984 and one from 1985, and this one is called Barber Bartok Jarrett. Now, as I mentioned already, this features two live performances that took place in 1984 and in 1985. And this sees Keith Jarrett playing the music of Samuel Barber and Bela Bartok, and also his own composition as well. So the first concert recording took place in 1984 at Kongresshalle Saarbrücken, and the second performance took place in 1985 in Tokyo, and it's an amazing album. Keith Jarrett playing with a full orchestra. The first performance conducted by his longtime collaborator Dennis Russell Davis, and the second performance was conducted by Kazushi Akiyama, and the orchestra of that concert was performed by New Japan Philharmonic Orchestra, and the first performance was performed by Rundfunk Sinfonieorchester Saarbrücken, and absolutely amazing stuff, really is. And it features two piano concertos on both performances, and it's just an amazing live performance. So let's have a quick look. So there we are. Now, tracks 1 to 3 is Samuel Barber Piano Concerto Op 38. So, track 1, we've got Allegro Appassionato, and then track 2, we got Canzone Moderato, and track 3, Allegro Molto. And this features Keith Jarrett on piano and Rundfunk Sinfonieorchester Saarbrücken, conducted by Dennis Russell Davis. And then on performance 2, we got Bela Bartok Piano Concerto number 3. And tracks 4 to 6, we got part 1, Allegretto, part 2, Adagio, Regicio, and part 3, Allegro Vivace, and Keith Jarrett on piano and the New Japan Philharmonic Orchestra. And then we've got track 7, the Tokyo Encore, Nothing But a Dream. So there's all quite long pieces and a few short ones in between, but absolutely amazing. So there is the track listing, some liner notes from Keith Jarrett about both performances, and a little bit about Barber and Bartok as well, and some more here as well. This is just merely about both composers' history and their place. There is the man there himself, and some archive newspaper clippings of Keith Jarrett, and production notes as well. So the standout tracks for me are Tokyo Encore, Nothing But a Dream, Allegro, Panashinato is another great track as well by Samuel Barber, and Allegro Molto is another great track as well, and Allegro Vivace is another great track as well, and Allegretto is another great track as well. Both performances are great, but I would probably lean more towards the Japanese performance. I think that one was very, very exceptional in my opinion, and both performances are great, but I did enjoy the Japanese performance maybe just a little bit more. But still a great album. Maybe they should have made this a double album. That's just my opinion. And I think both discs should have had the whole complete performance because they're both fantastic. But still a great live album. Highly recommend you check this one out. This is Keith Jarrett performing live on piano with a full orchestra. Doesn't get any better than that. So there you have it. Barber, Bartok, Jarrett. Excellent stuff and a great live performance from two different periods of Keith Jarrett's career performing live in concert. Tremendous stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 2019, and it's a double live solo piano album, and this one is called J.S. Bach, The Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. So this is a double live album which features a live performance that took place in 1987 in New York, and it features Keith Jarrett on piano playing the music of Johannes Sebastian Bach. And as we've seen previously, Keith Jarrett playing classical compositions in his own style and reinterpreting Bach's legendary compositions, and Keith Jarrett at his absolute best playing solo piano, and it's an amazing double live album and a real nice treat to hear Keith Jarrett playing these unbelievable compositions and proving that he is no slouch in the classical department. And as always, Keith Jarrett delivers excellent playing and is on top form. And for me, this is one of Keith Jarrett's best solo piano live albums. And it's a personal favourite of mine, as are many of these albums. And this one is just absolutely excellent. So we're just going to have a quick little look. So there he is, the man himself. And there's the track listing. So all of the compositions are relatively short pieces, clocking in at 2 minutes, 1 minute, some at 54 seconds, and minutes. They're all quite relatively short pieces, and the longest tracks are like 5 to 6 minutes long. So, fairly long, but most of these pieces are quite short, and they're like little mini suites in some ways. So, they're all like A major and A minor and B flat major. So they're all like different majors and D sharp minor. So they're all quite different pieces, but still very enjoyable. And there he is as well. And just a little bit of the production notes as well. But the whole album, from top to bottom, is excellent. Wouldn't like to say there's a standout track. You know, they're all like one continuous piece of music, but still highly enjoyable nonetheless. And it's a great album. You know, it's a live album, as you'd expect. Keith Jarrett always excels live, and he's one of those special musicians where he sounds even better live than he does in the studio, and it's a fantastic performance, as you'd expect from Keith Jarrett. So there you have it, J.S. Bach, The Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. Excellent double live album, courtesy of the one and only Keith Jarrett in solo piano performance mode. Tremendous stuff. So we move on to the next classical album, and this one came out in 2023, and it's a double album, and it's a solo piano album, and this one is called Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, and this features Keith Jarrett on piano, playing the music of Bach in his own style, reinterpreting Bach's classic material, and as you'd expect from a solo piano album, nothing but the absolute best, courtesy of Keith Jarrett, and it's a tremendous album. And most of the pieces on this album are fairly short, but still highly enjoyable. And Keith Jarrett, you know, there's something about him playing the music of Bach. It's almost like, you know, if Bach was still alive, this is kind of what he would sound like. And Keith Jarrett really channels the spirit of Bach, but still staying true to not only the compositions, but his own playing style as well. And it's a really lovely album. It really is. And it's just an amazing treat, as always, to hear Keith Jarrett playing in solo piano performance mode. It's just an unbelievable experience and a great listening experience as well. So we're just going to have a quick look. So there's the track listing. So most of the compositions are, you know, fairly shortish tracks. The shortest pieces are like 3 minutes to 5 minutes, and the longest pieces are like 6 to 7 minutes long. And they're made up of 6 different sonatas. So we've got Sonata 1 in a minor, Sonata 2 in a A flat major, Sonata 3 in E minor, and then on disc 2 we've got Sonata 4 in B flat major, and Sonata 5 in E flat major, and Sonata 6 in B minor. And there's the man himself, and there's a little bit about The Son and the Father by Keith Jarrett. And there's some more as well. And some more as well. And some more as well from Jarrett. This was actually written by Paul Griffiths. And we've got the man himself chilling. Nice. And we've also got production notes as well. Now, this recording session originally took place in 1984, but this is the first time that this performance was actually released on CD, and it was definitely well worth the wait. And you know that there's plenty of more gems just tucked away in the vault, just waiting to be heard. But this one was definitely a nice, welcome treat and very enjoyable. And Keith Jarrett in solo piano performance mode doesn't get any better than that. It's just great music and great playing from the man himself. It's just excellent stuff listening to Keith Jarrett reinterpret Bach's material. So there you have it. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Excellent stuff, and another favourite of mine, courtesy of Keith Jarrett. Love it. So which Keith Jarrett's classical album out of all 19 do I think is the best one? Well, as I said at the beginning, there are no bad albums in Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue. As I said before, there are some that are a little bit better than others. There are some that are excellent. There are some that are legendary. There are some that are unknown. And there are some that are underrated. And any one of these classical albums could easily be a number one or an all-time favourite. But if I had to choose one which I think is the best Keith Jarrett's classical album, I'm going with Bridge of Light. I think this for me was the one that Keith Jarrett really peaked as a classical composer, and he was just absolute on fire here. His compositions, the playing, everything from the orchestra to the arrangements to the orchestrations, everything about Bridge of Light is just excellent. And I'm not taking anything away from the other classical albums that Keith Jarrett has done, but there's just something about Bridge of Light that really captivates me and just makes it a very special album for me. I just think this is the one where Keith Jarrett really peaked as a classical composer. I just think it's absolutely brilliant. So there you have it. Keith Jarrett, Bridge of Light, for me, the best album out of his entire classical catalogue. Tremendous album, my all-time favourite. Love it. So that's going to be it from me. I am going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite album from Keith Jarrett's classical catalogue? Is it Bridge of Light, Handel Suites for Keyboard, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, The Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1, Barbara Bartok Jarrett, Piano Concertos K271, 453, 466, Adagio, and Fuge K546, or WA Mozart's Piano Concertos K467, 488, 595, the French Suites, 24 Preludes and Fugues, 87, Das Wundertämter Clavier Bush 1 or Bush 2, Goldberg Variations, Book of Ways, Ritual, The Celestial Hawk, In the Light, Luminescence, Hymns, Spheres, or Abozina. There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.